2024 will not be one that Aurigny celebrates. Delays and cancellations plagued the airline's passengers during the first half of the year, with many accusations of poor communication levied at the airline too. Ahead of a review into the airline's handling of its fleet restructuring, which coincided with the chaos earlier this year, I sat down with Aurigny's CEO, Nico Bezuidenhout, to find out what happened and what's going to happen next. I started off by trying to find out more about the man who runs Guernsey's airline.
I studied transport economics and industrial psychology. In truth, young and naive at the time, I never really had any idea that I'm going to end up in transport. In truth, I ended up studying economics, but didn't pay enough attention, and it was just easier to switch to transport economics. I then went into the rock concert industry of all things, and did rock concert promotion, so U2, Michael Jackson, Def Leppard, all of those guys in and out of South Africa. And because I was one of the first people in, and then started an online ticketing company in the late 90s. Because I was one of the first people in South Africa to start anything online when South African Airways wanted to embrace e-commerce at the time. They approached me to join them, which I decided to do for a 2-year period. I started heading up their e-commerce and distribution. They then asked me to do an assessment of how should they respond as a traditional full-service carrier to in competition to low-cost carriers. How should they respond? I did an assessment for them, gave them one of 4 options that I think they should do. One of which was start your own independent low-cost carrier and run it as an arm's-length business. To which they then said, fine, we like the 4th option and we want you to go do that. From there, I was then given 10 million US as seed capital and advised to go start an airline and run it independently from South African Airways. And from there, Mango Airlines was born. Operated 737-800 aircraft. A really interesting time in my career. Ran that airline for 10 years, built it from 0 market share to a 25% market share in South Africa. Profitable for 8 out of 10 years, and a very happy time. I then was asked to step in at South African Airways as the parent company. Much bigger organisation, so 12,000 employees, maintenance facilities like I just showed you here, except much bigger. That was, again, a different challenge at that time. During that time, I was president of the IATA AGM, which is an interesting thing. It's the first time that Africa ever hosted an IATA AGM.
Okay.
And in that context, you have about 2,000 airline senior executives coming together once every 2 years, I think it is. I served on the Star Alliance Chief Executive Board on 2 occasions, and then ended up leaving South African Airways. It's a state-owned business, and let's just say there were conflict at a political level. Joined Stelios with Fastjet PLC. Now, Fastjet, the principle for Fastjet was to replicate EasyJet in Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, different countries. Ran that for 3 and a bit years. Got tempted back to Mango and South African Airways. And just about then, the pandemic hit. And during that time, my wife had been affected by violent crime in South Africa on at least 2 occasions, held up at gunpoint. And from that standpoint, decided that we, as much as I love South Africa, but needed a safer environment. And then came across to Guernsey. Now, Aurigny, a unique airline, different airline, much smaller than what I'm used to. But on the upside, gave me a lot of exposure. Through your career, you tend to jump and skip certain steps, where with a small airline like this, it forces you to go back and actually pay attention to the detail. So I've been here now arrived here at the end of October 2020. I've got married. We've got an eldest son who lives in Dublin. Middle son who's just started varsity in Southampton, and then an 11-year-old little girl who pretty much runs the household. So that's me.
So enjoying life in Guernsey then as a family,
family
base.
That's
for your family.
That's the attraction. It's a safe, nice environment for a young family. And that was the main reason.
Yeah, okay. But in terms of Aurigny then, so it's Aurigny that brought you and your family to Guernsey. How would you describe Aurigny if you were telling someone not from Guernsey, this is where I work?
Well, I think as a community-based, community-centric airline that exists to serve the needs of this island-based community. It's a quirky regional carrier. It's by any stretch of the imagination, it's a small business scale-wise, but that ends up doing a lot with fairly limited assets for its scale.
And in terms of serving the community then, do you think Aurigny is fulfilling that purpose currently?
I think this specific year has been a utterly disappointing year from a reliability standpoint. There is no doubt that we have not delivered to our normal standards. Aurigny, when you look at back in 2018, for example, Aurigny's average punctuality rate was 5% higher than the average of all UK carriers operating to and from and within the UK. In the last 3 years, between 2020 and 23, we ended up growing that to, on average, about 8% above the UK average.
Okay.
So we're typically known for our punctuality and reliability. Last year, we were 5% ahead of British Airways, for example, in punctuality, better than EasyJet and the like. This year has been particularly challenging, and in this context, from a reliability standpoint, it has now been rectified. I think we're over the worst, but it has been a disappointing year. Okay,
well, in terms of then over the worst, we'll speak in more detail about this particular year. As you said, utterly disappointing. I think that's a phrase that many people would agree with. But Aurigny in general then, the small economies of scale we're working with, serving a community, what are the airline's biggest challenges?
Look, I think that we face some of the same challenges as any other business on the island, in the sense that cost of living for our employee base, skills shortages in some respects, because it's a highly specialised discipline in terms of engineering, pilots and the like. So attracting, recruiting, retaining the skills needed to run a specialised business like an airline is particularly challenging on an island of this nature.
Yeah, and some of those challenges in terms of experience and supply lines, we've just been meeting some of your staff, looking around the various departments. Those aren't just unique to Guernsey. That's an aviation problem that stemmed from the pandemic.
Yeah, indeed. If you look at, for example, ATR as one of the aircraft types, the number of spare parts that's tracked on the critically short list has more than doubled in the last 2 years. And that's true for ATRs, it's true for Embraers, it's true for Boeings. And that adversely affects all carriers, not just Aurigny.
Okay, and on the other side of the coin then, what are Aurigny's strengths, would you say?
Without a doubt, the passion and commitment that the employees have for the passengers. Because this is truly unique, as I've never experienced that, is that because we're such a small community, when you talk about a passenger, it's not some unknown, distant entity. It is more likely than not somebody over years, brother, sister, uncle, neighbour. And that means that the employees in Aurigny relate very differently to the passengers than you would normally have in bigger jurisdictions. And that is a unique strength, I think. And
we've met some of your staff today, and one of the striking factors is how long some of them have worked for the company. You're almost still the new boy. We've met some staff that have joined Aurigny this year, but you've got staff who have been here 44, 42, 30 plus years. That's quite unusual, I would say, in most industries now. I mean, does that stack up in aviation elsewhere that you've worked?
No, I think it generally aviation, especially in some of the maintenance disciplines, do tend to, and pilots in some of the pilot areas, tend to have longer serving employees. But even by aviation standards, Aurigny's pretty exceptional in that way.
Yeah. And as you said, everyone's almost working for making sure their brother, sister, neighbour gets home safe. And do you think that plays into some of those decision making processes and the care that people pay in their work?
Yeah, it does. I think we are the airline that will bring you home. We are the airline that will allow you to move flights forward, and flight forwarding, for example, if we need to get you home. We are the airline that's going to make sure that you know, if something is wrong with our aircraft and you can't get home from East Midlands, well, we're going to put you on a bus to get you home from Birmingham.
Yeah.
It is all about getting the islanders home, and that sometimes that makes us take decisions that we end up living to regret, in a sense.
Okay.
You know, there's a couple of months ago we had a flight coming into Guernsey that was very late. If we didn't have that commitment to bring islanders home, we probably wouldn't have taken off originally coming into Guernsey. We would have just potentially cancelled the flight and let that be that. But because we've got this absolute desire, and because we also know that tomorrow morning I have to have aircraft in place, and there's another bunch of passengers that will let down if we don't get this mission completed, we do go out of our way. Now, where we do absolutely draw the line, without any doubt, is when there's any safety risks. Yesterday, for example, there was adverse weather on the south coast of England that would have posed risk if we tried to fly through that weather. And in that case, we just will not do that. That is where we will not compromise.
Yeah, absolutely. But where some of those decisions are made for safety reasons or timing issues or any one of many factors, Aurigny, particularly this year, has come in line for some complaints. I say particularly this year because actually in my lifetime I'd say that one of the things people always complain about is transport on and off island, whether it's Aurigny or another carrier, air or sea. But Aurigny this year particularly, social media emphasises it, doesn't it? There's been lots of complaints. How do you and your staff here then feel about those complaints when they come in, first of all?
Well, in the first instance, we all take it very personally.
Yeah.
I take it personally from the standpoint that I feel that I should protect my employees.
Yeah.
And every employee has got a link to this island and runs deeper than most care to admit. So we too take it personally, but it's all about then going every step of the way to try and resolve the matters. Now, sometimes we fail, often we fail. Sometimes we fail to communicate accurately, or sometimes of late we potentially over-communicating. We came in for some flack in the last couple of days for communicating a 5-minute delay on flight changes. It's difficult to find out where exactly is where is that line. I think that in the coming months we'd probably err on over-communicating rather than under-communicating. But some of the criticism has been valid and legitimate, and we fully accept that our punctuality rate this year has been, where it normally is 4 to 8% above the UK average, this year at times we're 4 or 5% below the UK average, and that simply isn't acceptable.
I'm going to bring you back to the communication that you mentioned there, because that does seem to be a recurring theme of a number of complaints that we've seen on social media, and I appreciate your staff will be getting complaints, emails and telephone calls as well. But a lot of the complaints maybe aren't necessarily just around delays or cancellations, but it's around how those are communicated with the public. And you have learnt from those complaints, or from the issues that have arisen that have led to some of those complaints?
I think we continue to, every day is a school day in one way or the other. We've done a lot of development this year to, for example, give passengers dynamic and live access to flight disruption data. So you can see yourself directly into our systems when a flight is going to be delayed and how that flight might move going forward. In some cases we score own goals where it's just erroneous on our part. We could have communicated better. In other cases, you don't necessarily always have the complete information. If I, for example, know that tomorrow I'm going to have an aircraft out of base that's going to affect some passengers, I can't necessarily communicate to the passenger what the plan is for tomorrow, because I have to wait for tomorrow to happen before I can get approval from, say, Gatwick Airport that I can operate on an alternative slot. Sometimes it's a question that I can't ask, I'm not allowed to ask until the day of operation, which then leaves you a very short period of time to communicate. On top of the fact that there's no nice way of communicating a delay or cancellation.
People are always going to be disappointed, aren't they? Have there been times, though, this year perhaps, and I'm focusing on this year, I appreciate there's probably past events as well, but have there been occasions this year where you've thought, oh, we've really screwed up here, and you have really regretted what's happened?
Look, in the first instance, every flight that is delayed, we end up regretting in one way or the other. A lot of the incidents that we had this year, the vast majority, were utterly outside of our control.
Okay.
Now, if we look at what contributed, we've had, especially between February and March, we had dealt with a number of wild card events.
Yeah. The Black Swan event, I think it was referred to at one point.
Cygnets event.
Yeah.
And that is true. And these events consisted of, for example, a landing incident that ended up destroying a nose landing wheel on an ATR. It just so happens that a nose landing gear is in great shortage across the global industry. And to this day, that happened in February. To this day, we still don't have a new landing gear. It's still awaiting delay to come out of the manufacturer. And we've had to rely on loan landing gears, and it took us months. It took us 4 months to get that rectified, at least the loan landing gear on the aircraft. Now, then all of a sudden you're sitting with a small airline where you have 4 or 5 aircraft in your main fleet. If you unexpectedly lose a unit for 4 months, that's 20% of my capacity that is just ripped out from underneath me. Now, you make provision for backup plans. In this case, we had backup plans. We had a contract with a wet lease provider from the UK. And a wet lease provider is it's an airline that provides a service to another airline and will operate and provide you capacity and crew, aircraft and crew to operate your schedule. We had put that in place. That particular airline failed to deliver, notwithstanding us having a signed agreement and the physical aircraft actually being here.
Yeah.
From the 10th of January to the end of October, that was meant to be in place.
Yeah. And it just didn't.
It failed to materialize. We then end up, that nose landing gear event happened. That was within a week, preceded by the Embraer aircraft being grounded due to thrust reverser corrosion on its engines. Again, a totally unforeseen event, and now you've got 2 out of your 4 operating aircraft unexpectedly grounded.
Okay.
Your backup was the wet lease operator who fails to deliver, and therefore without capacity. There was a third maintenance event, which I won't go necessarily into the details right now, and these 3 events collectively between them had the effect of, for 106 days this year, we had between 25 and 75% of our available aircraft capacity taken out of commission.
Is there an issue then with fleet resilience? I mean, was this a problem that maybe you should have foreseen?
These events we do, on average, we do now in the current year about 16,000 flights per year. We've operated ATRs for many years.
Yeah.
We've not had one nose landing gear failure.
Okay.
We operated the Embraer for 10 years. Not once was there grounding due to corrosion.
Okay.
And for this to happen at the same time, in February, and February just so happened to be the foggiest February on record in Guernsey, according to the Guernsey Met Office.
Yeah, okay.
So now you have a combination of a multitude of events, and to an extent, do we expect some events to happen? Yes, we do. That is why I had the arrangement in place with the wet lease operator. So, but do you expect the wet lease operator to fail 2 events, and there was a third as well that I haven't gone into, 3 events to happen simultaneously, and your backup to fail?
Yeah.
The question then becomes, how many backups do you actually end up making?
And in terms of the fleet then, because the jet then left local service, was it in April? Was that managed appropriately?
The jet ultimately left at the end of May.
End of May, okay.
So firstly, the jet turned 10 on the 14th of June, and that is when that happens, the aircraft is due 10-year checks. So that's a very heavy maintenance check that then has to happen. So that's the pacing factor of when the aircraft had to leave. There's another aspect, not just calendar, but amount of hours available on the aircraft. The aircraft had 150 hours left that it could be flown, or alternatively the 14th of June, whichever comes first. So we had very limited time that we could use that aircraft. What made that more complicated was the fact that corrosion was discovered on the thrust reverses of that aircraft on both sides, which resulted in the aircraft being grounded immediately. And that is not an optional, it's not a management discretion aspect.
That's a safety aspect. It's
a safety aspect. You found corrosion that you did not know existed on the aircraft. Now you have found it. You can't unfind it.
Okay.
And you have to ground the aircraft. And that is why the aircraft wasn't fully available to be used, rather than anything to do with the exit of the aircraft. Even if we kept that aircraft and we didn't sell it, that same event would have happened. And that's why I think that it's fully understandable why the local community would relate the exit of the Embraer and some of our new route launches with unreliability, because it happened at the same time. But they don't relate.
Should those new routes have been launched then, in light of the jet having the corrosion, the ATR problems, the fleet issues that we're having? I mean, was it right to go ahead with the new route launches?
You don't. Those routes were launched on the 20th of October 2023.
Okay.
Well before. These events occurred in February and in March.
And again, you couldn't foresee those ones. Okay.
And the new event, these new routes only started on the 1st of April. And that kind of illustrates the point. These disruptions predated the launch of the new routes.
Okay. In terms of the routes, does Aurigny do too much? Because there does seem to be a hell of a network that Aurigny flies to UK destinations, and now there seems to be increasing numbers of European destinations, perhaps only seasonally. But Aurigny seems to do a lot for a small airline.
Yes, we do a lot for a small airline, and we have expanded connectivity from pre-pandemic periods. And that has also helped aviation in Guernsey to recover much quicker than, for example, the Isle of Man. Now, if you look at the Isle of Man, 84,000 population, Guernsey 65,000 population, it's the closest comparator that we can get. People sometimes like to compare us with Jersey just because it's close by, but Jersey is 104,000 people. It's a substantially bigger population and economy than what Guernsey is. So comparing to the Isle of Man, our recovery rate has been much stronger in terms of volumes as well as network breadth. Now, what do we focus on? We first and foremost focus on key lifeline routes. Out of the 16,000 flights that we do per year, approximately just over 9,000, 9,500 flights are either from Guernsey to Alderney, Guernsey to Southampton, or Guernsey to Gatwick. The three designated lifeline routes. 58% of our flight activity is to those three routes.
Okay.
Then we've increased capacity into the London market this year. And that's specifically because the financial services sector requires and has asked us to do more frequencies into London, specifically adding London City. So between London City and then Stansted, we've got 1,400 or thereabouts flights per year. So adding London as a point means that 70% of our flying goes to London or lifeline routes. Then Manchester. Manchester is the only permanent point we've got in the north of England. That's another, call it 10% of our output. So 80% of our output is lifeline routes, the City of London or Manchester, 80%. When we then look at European destinations, less than 3% of our annual flight rotations are to destinations outside of the UK.
And is that because they're seasonal as well? So they're not...
Well, no, that includes Paris, for example. That's twice a week on a Monday and a Friday year-round. And it includes Dublin, that's 3 times a week.
Okay.
Now, including those two destinations as well as our European destinations, collectively it's less than 3% of our flight activity. And the ad hoc European destinations typically are flown on a Saturday afternoon. Now, on a Saturday afternoon, it's a low utilization period.
Okay.
The aircraft is sitting in the hangar, it's available, it's not doing anything else. The crew have already been paid for. So under that condition, I'm managing this business on behalf of islanders. It's the islanders' assets. You don't want your assets sitting on the ground.
Okay.
That does not help connectivity on the island. And it doesn't conflict with our core mandate of operating into lifeline routes.
Okay. I mean, as you said, you're running the airline as a business on behalf of the islanders, island residents, taxpayers effectively. The States of Guernsey have now owned the airline for, I think it's 21 years. So it far predates when you came into Guernsey. What are your views on state ownership of Aurigny? Do you think it is working?
I think that, so first I'm going to answer from a more generic perspective.
Yep.
I don't believe that there's a common narrative or popular narrative that state-owned businesses by default are useless. Now, I disagree with that notion.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the world's leading airlines, Emirates, for example, Qatar, they're state-owned.
Okay.
And it doesn't make them by default ineffective. In as far as Aurigny is concerned, and Guernsey, I think that we need to remember that Guernsey is a very small market, 65,000 people. That's an average town size that typically wouldn't have an airline dedicated and at its beck and call. During the course of the pandemic, the value of owning Aurigny was clearly illustrated. Now, having said all of that, the criticism that Aurigny has had historically was the fact that it's lost money. Now, one of my key mandates provided to me by the States was my second most important objective is stop losing money.
Okay.
The number one objective is protect lifeline routes. Number two is stop losing money.
Not make money.
No, not
just
make money.
Stop losing money.
Stop losing money.
Okay.
The number three objective is whatever profits you make, pass that back into lower fares or better connectivity to the islanders.
Okay.
So those are my three objectives.
Yeah.
And I'm a typical male in that regard. When I spoke to the States, I asked them to please give me numbers. 1, 2, 3, and what's most important, and I'll follow it in that order. So from an Aurigny standpoint, I think that it's perfectly legitimate for the state, given the dependence and importance that we have as an island on air connectivity, to have some form of say and control over the asset, but then also make sure that the asset doesn't lose money. Now, in the last, in 2022, 2023, last year, for example, we achieved record profitability, record turnover, carried more passengers than ever before, to more destinations than ever before. And our punctuality rate was in the top 5 within the UK.
Yeah.
So every box in that regard ticked. And importantly, the airfare inflation since the pandemic, between 2019 and now, airfare inflation was 23% over the full period.
Okay.
So below RPI increases on fares.
Okay.
And then I contrasted with the Isle of Man, for example. The Isle of Man took a decision to forsake ownership of the airline that they used to have. They sit in a situation where there's a low-cost carrier that now controls 60% of that market. But the interesting fact is when you go to the air travel inflation index that the Isle of Man publishes, you'll see that their airfares increased by 50% between 2019 and 2024. Ours by 24%. So, and that follows on the standpoint that the states have told me that they don't want profits. They don't want losses, but they don't want profits. So whatever profits you make, reduce the cost of airfares, and that's what we've done. Now, if you didn't own an airline, you can't do that. You can't dictate a dividend policy with private enterprise. You can't say to a private enterprise, I expect that you're going to focus on Gatwick or this airport or that airport. You're at the whim of what that airline says they will do.
In terms of reducing fares, though, I think listeners, readers will say, well, actually, fares haven't reduced. It is a narrative, isn't it? The fares are expensive. I'm pretty sure if you did the inflation calculation between 1980 and 2000 and 2020, they're actually probably not, in real terms, that much more expensive. But people will say, actually, it's very expensive to fly to Gatwick.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll
What would you say?
touch on that. So I did in fact do that calculation. So in 1984, the lowest fare between Guernsey and Gatwick was $49.99.
Okay.
Our lowest fare right now between Guernsey and Gatwick is $59.99. We earlier in the year had launch fares to London City at $29.99. Inflation adjusted, the entry level fare, if it was $49.99 in 1984, it's meant to be £130 now.
Okay.
And it's far from. If you look at the next 7 days, first 7 days in October, 1st to the 7th, the lowest fares available on Aurigny starts at $69.99 and it goes up to $109.99.
Is that into the Gatwick market?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's the lowest fare on any one of those 7 days.
And how many
range.
seats are available at those rates?
So at the £109 level, they'd probably be on that flight probably 5 to 10 on that particular flight.
But the 69 or the 49.99?
When you get to the $49.99, you're going to get to about 2 or 3.
Okay.
So it will reduce.
And that's where it pays to book early, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
so
indeed.
those will go first.
Yeah, they will go first. But right now, as I said, you can still get 4 next week. To book 4 next week, you can get a fare for $69.99 into the UK, into London. Now, when I compare that to the Isle of Man, a low-cost carrier in that case, they operate 2 flights a day between the Isle of Man and Gatwick. When you check online right now, the lowest fares you can get, and at least and to try and make it comparable, assume that you at least need to be able to use the overhead stowage. Not checking anything else in, but just at least use the overhead stowage, because that you can't go away for 2 or 3 days without at least putting something.
Yeah.
So when you look at that price point, their lowest fares start at £84 to £141 on Isle of Man to Gatwick. And that's for 2 flights a day. That lowest fare is available for the flight that lands at 9:20 at night. So you've got no chance of doing a same day return. You're in for a hotel night too. And you can do that on 2 flights per day. In our case, you've now got 10 flights per day between Guernsey and London. There's another regional carrier that operates between the Isle of Man and 2 London ports. Their fares start between £140 up to £208, again for next week, for the 7-day period. Again, you can't do a same-day return. So relative to comparable, same like-for-like type of crown dependencies, the cost of air travel is not more expensive here relative to the Isle of Man, for example. Now, it is true that in a market like Jersey, for example, competitive tensions mean that British Airways and EasyJet are at each other's throats and they drive price points down. Whether that's sustainable is, of course, a different debate, and to what extent airport fee subsidies, etc., plays a role is an unknown factor. If I look at, in the case of Guernsey, Guernsey Airport is not subsidised by the states, and therefore the charges that they charge are not subsidised either. So for an average passenger coming from Gatwick, for example, the average fare, and I don't mind disclosing this, the average fare paid across a full year to Gatwick is between £90 and £100 for a one-way fare. And that is and of course there are some passengers who end up going on Easter weekend and you end up paying £200, and there's some who paid £50. So the average is between 90 and 100. Now, if you're leaving from Gatwick to come to Guernsey, out of your £90 that you may have paid, £45 goes to Gatwick Airport, Guernsey Airport, and the UK government in air passenger duties, leaving us with £55 or £45 if you paid £90 to pay everything else of actually delivering that service. You can also see that when we sold tickets at $29.99, we were losing money hand over fist on those specific sales. Of course, we would make it up on other transactions. So I think that in the end, there's a cost associated to delivering a service in a small-scale business. And that cost would be the same no matter which carrier. If you replaced Aurigny with Aurigny 2 or something else, owned by somebody else, your cost isn't going to change. The cost of the aircraft is the same. The cost of the fuel is the same. The airport charges are the same. The only difference is that because this government owns Aurigny, Aurigny is based here. So £20 million per year gets spent in the economy on this island to employ people, to rent offices, to pay airport fees, to pay interest and tax, social security, etc. £20 million per year that comes back into the economy, bearing in mind that Aurigny's turnover is only about £60 million a year. So in the end, is it more expensive to travel between an island location and bigger airports? Yes, it is. Unfortunately, it's a reality, but that's the scale that we've got. It's also the level of backup that we want or don't want. Now, if we changed the remit and we said we're okay with 3 flights a day to like the Isle of Man. Isle of Man, between 2 carriers, they've got 5 flights a day going into London. If the society says we only want 5 flights a day, well, fine, we can pare that back and we can do the 5 flights a day.
Yeah.
Whether that's useful or not for the economy, there's an open question.
If I can ask you as well, from conversations we had while we were being taken around the hangar and the various offices, you referenced the Isle of Man and Jersey and Guernsey airports and the way the 3 island airports are run. Well, there was that one example, wasn't there? Was it an Exeter flight? Or it was a flight from the UK that was turned back? And those kind of issues obviously did result in some criticism of Aurigny, also of the airport.
Yeah, I think that, like, in the first instance, it is fairly normal and standard for airports and airlines to be in a conflict position.
Yeah,
it's not specific to this island. It happens from time to time. I think that this year, fundamentally due to our reliability challenges, has placed additional challenges, strain on that working relationship, and it's something that we're trying to rectify now. In the first instance, from Aurigny's standpoint, it's all about improving reliability.
Yeah.
And then secondly, from an airport standpoint, it's seeing how can we better accommodate each other's requirements. In the end, we both have a singular objective, and that is to transport passengers safely, bring our islanders back home safely, and provide that infrastructure. And we must surely find a way to align those objectives. And I think a lot of effort is going into that specific exercise.
In terms of aligning those objectives, the Chamber of Commerce, James Eady-Golightly, penned some thoughts recently with suggestions for how, not necessarily aimed solely at Aurigny, but how air connectivity could be improved. And there were suggestions for the airport. There were also suggestions for Aurigny, one of which actually focused on Blue Islands and Aurigny. Did you have any thoughts on that? I mean, it was looked at a decade ago and it never went anywhere. Is it something that you think should be looked at now?
I think that in the first instance, both Blue Islands and Aurigny are relatively subscale by aviation standards.
Yeah.
Now, what we have tried to do as our respective management teams is to try and see where can we collaborate to try and almost mimic scale, and how can we cooperate. So therefore, we've standardized. Blue Islands and ourselves use the same reservations platform, the same operation systems. We've got the same type of aircraft that we end up using. We co-chair an interline on Southampton. We provide ground handling services for them here in Guernsey. And at times of operational disruption, we will, if possible, try and assist each other.
Yeah. So
we already closely collaborate in as much as we can. Whether or not that can take on a deeper level of collaboration is something that cannot be excluded. In the end, I think that obviously Blue Islands has got its shareholders, and they will go in a certain direction and have plans for their business. And we've got our shareholders, but in the end, it's not something that can be excluded. I think that all options should be looked at all times. And if not through mergers or the like, how else can we streamline and smooth and make the process for the passengers smoother by collaborating as closely as possible?
Okay, and I'm going to go, if we go back a step then to passengers. So as you said earlier on, Aurigny used to have very good standards of punctuality and reliability. That's not been the case this year, by your own admission. But are we looking to get back into that this year? Do you think the second half of this year will the stats look more positive in terms of that punctuality and reliability?
Yes, definitely. We already saw a situation where, for example, in June, our punctuality rate was back to the average in the UK.
Okay.
And that was true through to the end of July. In August again happened to be not as bad as February in terms of weather, but in August it was foggiest since 1997. So much better than February, but still challenging. We also lost capacity from an ACMI provider in the middle of August. That particular carrier had to remove its aircraft to Paris, or to Toulouse, where it had to undergo a nose landing gear inspection and check. They found defects. It delayed the return of that aircraft. We ended up replacing it, but there were 10 days of disruption suffered as a consequence. Subsequent to that, for the month of September, our punctuality rate is again back to the UK average. So I believe that September, October, November, December, weather aside, you will see punctuality rates back to normal.
And do you think that will go some way to rebuilding trust with some customers and some less frequent flyers that perhaps might have been breached early this year, with some of those events that you mentioned earlier?
In the end, the trust was broken one flight at a time, and it will be earned one flight at a time.
Okay. Just to touch on another subject then as well, where I think it comes down to trust as well. Ourselves at Bailiwick Express and I believe other outlets were sent an email making some allegations against some Aurigny staff. I know that's being dealt with through an internal inquiry. Are you able to say anything on that at this stage? There were some comments alleged, which I know some people found quite upsetting, regarding passengers with different needs, disabled passengers.
That process is being run by our HR department. They're investigating the process. I'm not personally close to it. It's done by HR, as it should be. This is an allegation that's been made, that the veracity of that allegation has to be tested. And our HR department will be doing so. At a more generic level, or in any cases, we provide assistance to passengers, whether that's passengers with reduced mobility or other forms of assistance being required, to approximately 600 passengers per month, every month. In the vast majority of these cases, we don't have any challenges. It's delivered successfully. Passengers are happy. In some instances, we err. Now, whether it's ourselves, typically this type of assistance is provided by the airport or a contractor to the airport, which is the case in every single airport we operate to, with the exception of the Guernsey airport, where we provide that service. It's not available from the airport. The vast majority of cases are successful. We have had one or two instances where either ourselves or a service provider has failed, which we regret. But generally speaking, our staff, it's top of mind awareness. Our staff have been trained in identifying passengers with hidden disabilities, dealing with passengers with visible disabilities of sorts. So from that standpoint, I think that our commitment is unwavering to providing the assistance where we need. In as far as the incident that was reported, that will be investigated, is being investigated, and will be reported in due course.
Okay, so in terms of then rebuilding that kind of trust, that relationship, a positive relationship then with customers, 2024, we're 3/4 of the way through, say. How do you feel for the remainder of this year and going into 2025?
I think that there's been a number of successes, which we unfortunately, just because of the magnitude of the challenges, that we end up overlooking. The reintroduction of London City has been successful. Passenger volumes, load factors are pretty much on par with what we see in Gatwick. So we have affected a change in the way that we look at travel between Guernsey and London. Historically, when we looked at Guernsey to London, it's always been Gatwick and almost nothing else.
Yeah.
Whereas today, we've got 75% of our volumes go through Gatwick, 25% goes through London City. So that's been a great victory. We've increased the level of the frequency of connectivity between Guernsey and the City of London by 34% this year. We are, as a jurisdiction, one of the most well-connected by frequency jurisdictions to the financial centre that's London, and that's specifically important given the reliance on the financial services sector that we've got on this island.
Do you think is there still demand for a Heathrow service?
I think I've got a demand for the Heathrow service twice a year when I go to South Africa because the flight goes out of Heathrow.
Yeah.
But that's only on those 2 days. For the rest of the time, I don't have a need for it. So I think there are definitely some passengers who would, on occasion, have the need. Historically, when I look, though, at 2019, when Flybe had a service, twice daily service between Guernsey and Heathrow, notwithstanding a £28 per passenger subsidy, the route wasn't successful. Flybe exited at the end of 2019 on the back of filling on average 64% of the seats.
Okay.
So depends on where you want to go and when you want to go. There is definitely a legitimate ad hoc need, but is it sustainable? Is it justifiable and viable? That's the open debate. Bearing in mind that Heathrow is one of the most expensive airports in the world. You have to wonder whether or not it would be viable and the demand truly exists for it.
Okay. But in terms of London, there's increased capacity, and as you yourself referenced, Guernsey's financial services sector is so important to the island. 54% of flights, did you say?
54% of the economy is either directly or a support industry related to the financial services.
And that will translate into personnel within that sector, obviously, coming and going through the airport with Aurigny. But there is that capacity at Gatwick and London City.
Yes, which provides us now, as opposed to having a single dependency on a single airport, which Gatwick is the world's busiest single runway airport. It's useful to have an alternative scenario and not have all your eggs in one basket. Secondly, a route like Paris on Mondays and Fridays, that has been amazingly successful. 77% of our seats over summer were sold out in Paris. It means that you as a consumer can get from Guernsey to Paris in, call it an hour and a half in total travel time. Whereas if you were the same passenger sitting in Jersey, that would take you 6 hours and a connection via Gatwick before you could get to Paris.
Is the Paris route going to be continuing long term?
For as long as it's supported by the community, we will deliver the service. And thus far, we've had support and an underwriting of the route by the Committee for Economic Development.
Yeah.
We've not had to draw on that that security, essentially. And for as long as the route remains supported by the community, we will continue operating it. Yeah. Plus the route, depending on what month of the year, but you look at about 30% of the passenger flows on that route represent inbound passengers. That supports the tourism industry in Guernsey. Similarly, our Dublin services have been effective at 3 frequencies a week. During summer, we're trying to get more slots for winter. But that has been successful, and of course the next step is for us to interline, for example, with Aer Lingus, so that where Dublin really comes into its own is your ability to connect into North America and do your TSA and customs clearance in Dublin, and not stand in the immigration queue in JFK, for example. So that has worked well for us. Edinburgh has worked surprisingly well, given that it's only one flight a week. There's been others that didn't work well. Liverpool hasn't worked. There was method behind the madness. When we withdrew the Embraer, we needed additional capacity into Manchester. So for us, the option there was you either put it into Manchester or you put it into Liverpool. Similar catchment area, but potentially not a full overlap. In the end, it doesn't justify operating Liverpool, so we won't be operating Liverpool next year. Newquay was a short 6-week experiment. We had aircraft capacity available. We're unlikely to do that necessarily next year again. So there's been some good successes. It was just overwhelming ultimately in terms of the level of disruptions that we have suffered this year. We've gained some learnings. We've improved some levels of communication. There's more to be done, and in the end, we'll get our reliability levels back to where it needs to be. But the next day is going to come, and there will be some delay somewhere, because again, we don't operate in a vacuum. In the end, for example, this morning, our London City flight was an hour delayed, not due to anything else, but the fact that there was weather in London City. We couldn't take off. They wouldn't allow us to take off, and we had to hold the aircraft for an hour before the weather cleared. And then that does have an effect. It does have a knock-on effect. And of course, when you then get to a flight at 7 o'clock at night, as a passenger, I don't expect you to know that the reason why you are late is because of a flight that was late this morning at 7 o'clock that knocks on.
And we referenced this earlier though, but a lot of the complaints earlier this year were around communication. Should those things be communicated to the public? Are they communicated to passengers at the moment? How are they communicated?
They are through a couple of ways. One, our primary way is we've got a disruption page on our website where we refer you to. There's 2 elements to that page. The one is the qualitative narrative, i.e. telling you what has happened and why it's happened, and then a dynamic and real-time flight tracker that allows you to see exactly what time your flight is currently estimated to depart. Now, of course, that will keep on changing depending on what the specific challenge might or might not be. Equally, then we've done some further development that automates SMS and WhatsApp and email communication. The downside, of course, of that is now that whenever we change a flight, even if it's just by 5 minutes, you're going to get an email that tells you your flight has been changed by 5 minutes. But in the end, some people want to know it's going to be changed by 5 minutes and others don't. So at this point, I'm almost adopting the approach of saying that if you didn't want to know, then ignore the email. But there's somebody else who did want to know, and I've got no ways of knowing which category you fall in. I had a contract with you to say that I'm going to transport you at X time. Now I'm changing that time, and therefore I'm letting you know.
Okay. And then if we go back, so 2025, it will be here before we know it, won't it? How are you feeling positive going into next year?
I am. I think that, firstly, as far as this year is concerned, I'm disappointed in the fact that we missed celebrating the successes we achieved last year. Last year was by far the best year on record for this airline.
And it gets forgotten, doesn't it, then, when...
We never even got to celebrating it, because before we knew it, February was on us and our misery started. As far as next year is concerned, I am looking forward to next year. A lot of the pain has gone through the system this year. In the end, when you complicate your fleet, like we did with the Embraer, there's a price to pay to unscramble that egg. Now, back in 2020 or 2021, when we put forward a business strategy to the States, it was clear that if we're going to keep the Embraer, that we're going to have to spend £10 million in fixing that Embraer. We decided to not keep it, but we ended up having to spend money otherwise. So this year is not financially very successful. It's not successful at all financially. Because our commitment is to the island, we've spent every bit of penny we needed to spend to try and recover services. But looking forward, as far as next year is concerned, we've proven that the business can be profitable. We've done the fleet change. We've done the network changes. So I do look forward to a good next year.
And you mentioned the 3 priorities the States gave you, and number 2 and number 3 were reduce the losses.
And number 3 is to the extent that you then generate profits, pass it back as lower fares, and support the local economy as much as you can, and connectivity.
So in terms of, because people always want to know how much money Aurigny is losing or making, Aurigny will lose money 2024.
Yeah.
2025,
There will be break even. Our objective is always break even. You can't exactly make it. You're either going to make, last year we made, I forget, £1 million profit. I didn't mean to make £1 million profit. It's difficult to exactly pin it. But our objective ultimately is don't make money, don't lose money. Rather than pass back in lower fares and greater connectivity. That's the objective.